The wind rolled off the Tetons like a warning, that morning, sharp and restless. Autumn had already bitten into the edges of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and the air carried the scent of frost and pine. Ethan Brooks stood outside his weathered barn, hands buried in the pockets of his canvas coat, watching the mist rise off the pasture where Shadow stood, unmoving. "Come on, boy," Ethan called gently, his voice low and gravelly from years of disuse. "Let's get you inside before the snow makes up its mind." Shadow was a Morgan, tall and black as midnight, with eyes that always seemed to understand more than they should. He'd been with Ethan since he was a foal, back when Ethan still wore a uniform and believed in beginnings. These days, the only thing Ethan believed in was quiet, and Shadow had never betrayed that. But this morning, something was wrong. Shadow didn't move toward him. He took a single step back, ears pinned and tail twitching. Then, without warning, he reared slightly, let out a piercing whinny, and planted his hooves like he was standing against the devil himself. Ethan frowned and stepped closer. "Hey, easy," he murmured, reaching for the lead rope. The moment the rope tightened, Shadow jerked his head violently, nearly pulling Ethan off balance. His nostrils flared and he began to breathe fast and shallow. His eyes, normally calm, showed too much white. Ethan froze. This wasn't just stubbornness. This was fear. "What the hell's gotten into you?" he muttered. He tried circling around, coaxing Shadow from the rear of the barn, thinking maybe something spooked him from the front. But the reaction was the same. The moment they got close, Shadow stiffened, snorted loudly, and dug a hoof into the cold ground like he was bracing for a fight. Inside the barn, everything looked the same. Fresh hay, no strange smells, tools still where Ethan had left them. But still, Shadow refused. It had never happened before. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the stillness. A silver pickup came to a stop near the barn, and Jesse Tran climbed out, carrying a box of engine parts in one hand and a half-eaten apple in the other. He took one look at Shadow and grinned. "Did you piss him off, or is he seeing ghosts now?" Ethan gave him a tired glance. "He won't go in." Jesse walked up and stood beside him, chewing thoughtfully. "That ain't like him." "You think?" Just then, a second figure approached. Ruby Myers carrying a basket of eggs, her long red scarf blowing behind her. She lived just a half-mile down the road and had a sixth sense for when something felt off. "I brought eggs," she said, eyes flicking from Ethan to Shadow. "What's going on here?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Ruby was already reading the scene. Shadow's posture, the whites of his eyes, the way he refused to take a single step closer to the barn. "Horses don't lie, Ethan," she said. "If he says something's wrong, you better listen." The three of them stood there in the cold, watching the horse as he stared toward the barn like something inside was watching back. "Could be a snake," Jesse offered. "Or something died in there. Animals can smell things we can't." Ruby shifted the basket of eggs on her hip. "Could be," she said. "Or maybe it's just waking up." Ethan looked at her. "What is?" Ruby hesitated. "There was a girl, 20 years ago, Claire Monroe, went missing from this town. Disappeared without a trace." Jesse looked sharply at her. "Ruby." "I'm just saying." Ruby shrugged. "This barn. It used to belong to Lester Crane, remember?" "Don't start," Jesse muttered. But the seed had been planted. That evening, Ethan walked the barn alone. The lantern in his hand cast long, flickering shadows across the walls. He examined the stalls one by one. Everything was in order. Clean bedding. Tools hung neatly. But as he passed the rear wall, something tugged at the edge of his awareness. He paused. The back wall. It felt closer. He stepped forward and laid a hand against the wooden slats. The air was colder here. The wood was smooth but subtly different, slightly newer, or maybe just wrong. He shook his head and turned away, but the feeling stayed with him. All night. Later, he sat at his kitchen window, a single bulb burning overhead. The barn light glowed faintly through the mist that had begun to settle over the land like a shroud, and out in the distance, Shadow stood, still, silent, watching the barn like it was guarding something, or waiting for it to wake up. Ethan sipped his coffee, staring out the window, unease pooling in his gut. Whatever it is, Shadow knew it first, and Ethan was finally starting to listen. By mid-morning, frost still clung to the edges of the fence rails like brittle lace. Ethan hadn't slept. Not really. He'd tossed on the couch most of the night, glancing toward the window every hour, drawn back again and again by the sight of Shadow standing sentinel outside the barn. The horse hadn't moved. By sunrise, Ethan couldn't shake the chill crawling up his spine. It wasn't just the cold air. It was something else. Something that whispered in the stillness and settled in the space between logic and instinct. He pulled on his coat, grabbed his old tape measure, and walked out to the barn. Shadow tracked him with his eyes but stayed rooted in place, a few dozen yards from the barn doors, muscles tight like coiled wire. Ethan gave him a long look, then turned and walked inside alone. Dust swirled in the shafts of morning light. The smell of hay and aged wood filled the air. Everything looked ordinary, just like the night before, but the feeling hadn't left. He moved slowly to the rear wall, trying to stay aware of every detail. He remembered building this barn with his father, remembered every nail, every board. But now, standing inside, something didn't line up. He pulled the tape measure from his pocket and began measuring from front to back, double-checking with the layout he'd memorized years ago. When he stepped outside to measure the exterior, his brow furrowed. The interior was shorter, not by much, less than 2 feet, but in a building he'd practically built with his own hands, that wasn't nothing. What the hell? A honk from the gravel drive made him look up. Jesse's truck rolled in again, this time with tools in the bed. He stepped out with a thermos in one hand and a flashlight in the other. "You look like a man who's been haunted by blueprints," Jesse said. "Bring that light in here," Ethan called. Inside, Ethan explained what he'd found. Jesse walked the wall with him, tapping the boards slowly with the end of a screwdriver. Most of them responded with a dull, solid thump. But then, talk. Jesse paused. "Again," Ethan said. "Talk." The sound was hollower, softer. Jesse knocked again, then ran his fingers along the seams of the board. "These planks here look newer." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You sure? Positive. See the grain? And these nails, they're modern. The rest of this barn was built with iron spikes, but these, machine-pressed." They exchanged a glance. Ethan grabbed a hammer. "You planning to tear into your own barn?" Jesse asked. "If there's a reason my horse refuses to step foot in here, I'm damn well going to find out why." As if on cue, Shadow let out a long, anxious whinny from outside. Both men turned to the sound, unsettled. Ruby appeared moments later, drawn by the noise, cradling a mug of coffee in her gloved hands. "He's still out there?" she asked. "Like he's guarding the place," Ethan muttered. Ruby stepped inside, eyes narrowing at the back wall. "You found something." "Maybe," Jesse said. "This section's hollow and newer." Ruby walked up slowly, her hand brushing the boards. "This barn used to belong to Lester Crane, right?" Ethan nodded. Ruby's expression grew distant. "He always gave me the creeps. Used to call himself the Watchman. Said he could see things other people ignored. Town figured he was just crazy." "What happened to him?" Jesse asked. "Vanished," she said softly. 20 years ago, right after Claire Monroe went missing." Jesse stiffened. "You really think?" "I don't know what I think," Ruby said, her voice almost a whisper. "But Claire was my student once. Sweet girl. Taught 2nd grade at the elementary school. Then, one day, gone." Silence fell. Shadow whinnied again, more sharply this time. "Let's open it," Ethan said. Jesse hesitated, then nodded. I'll get the crowbar." As they worked, pulling boards free one by one, dust rained down and filled the air with the scent of rot and age. The planks groaned as if protesting, and behind them, stone, a wall of stacked rock and mortar, unnatural and crude, and a gap, a small dark space behind the stones, large enough to crawl through. The air that poured out was cold, thick with something metallic and sour. Jesse gagged, pulling his shirt over his face. God, smells like something died in there. Ruby's face paled. Shadow neighed outside, louder this time, hooves stamping the frozen dirt. Ethan leaned forward, shining his flashlight into the darkness behind the wall. The beam disappeared into pitch, swallowed like water down a well. "There's something back there," he said, voice low. Nobody answered. They all knew it. Whatever it was, it had been hidden for a long time, and Shadow had known it was there before any of them. The moment the last board gave way with a sharp crack, silence fell over the barn like a dropped curtain. Ethan stood still, the pry bar still warm in his hand, heart thudding. Behind the wood, the old stone wall loomed, uneven, gray, and damp in patches. Jesse ran the beam of his flashlight along the surface, exposing coarse mortar, ancient-looking seams, and stains that looked too dark to be just dirt. Ruby edged forward, eyes wide. That's not part of the original barn." "No," Ethan murmured. "Not even close." Jesse knelt, tapping the stone lightly with the flashlight handle. It gave back a dull, hollow echo. "There's a gap back here. Something's behind this wall." "And Shadow knew it," Ruby added quietly. Outside, the Morgan stallion paced the fence line, his ears pinned, tail swishing hard against the cold wind. He hadn't come near the barn all day. That alone made Ethan more nervous than any creaking board or bad smell. He pulled on gloves, grabbed the crowbar again, and began working at one of the stones. It shifted easier than he expected, loose in the mortar. Within minutes, he'd pried out 2 more. Dust billowed out and the scent hit them full force. Pungent, sour rot mixed with the unmistakable metallic tang of old blood. Jesse stepped back gagging, pulling his shirt up over his face. "Jesus, that's death." Ethan didn't answer. He pressed his shoulder to the gap and leaned in. The flashlight beam reached inside a narrow chamber, no wider than a crawl space, no taller than 4 feet. The walls were stone, the floor earthen and uneven. The light caught on something pale in the dirt. Bones. First just a sliver, a curved rib, then a femur half buried under a tattered swatch of fabric. Ethan went still. Jesse muttered, "Oh my God." Ruby clutched the edge of the stall gate, eyes fixed on the opening. "Tell me I'm wrong," she whispered. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." Ethan stepped back and nodded once. "It is." He turned and pulled the shop light from the corner, setting it up to spill light into the hidden space. Jesse grabbed a breathing mask from his truck and handed it to Ethan, who refused with a grim shake of the head. He dropped to his knees, crawled partway inside, and carefully swept his gloved hands over the bones and fragments. Near the back wall, something glinted beneath the dirt. A locket. He lifted it gently and wiped away grime with his thumb. The silver had tarnished almost black, but it opened with a soft click. Inside was a photograph. Faded, but still clear enough. A young woman with a kind smile and soft curls. Ruby gasped. "Claire." Ethan met her eyes. "You're sure?" "I taught her in Sunday school," she said hoarsely. "She used to bring me wildflowers every spring. She was sweet, gentle. Everyone loved her." Jesse crouched beside them. "Claire Monroe. She disappeared 20 years ago, right? And Lester Crane was questioned but never charged?" Ruby nodded slowly. "They dated. But she broke it off. Said he was controlling. Strange. When she vanished, no one could find a trace." Ethan looked down at the carved stone behind the remains. "There's more." With his glove, he brushed away more layers of dirt and dust. Shallow marks appeared in the stone. Not with a chisel, no, They were ragged, like they'd been scratched with fingernails or something harder but desperate. One word stood out clearly: help. And beneath it, shakily etched, Claire Monroe. Ruby made a choking sound. She was alive in here, long enough to leave her name. They all stood frozen for a long moment, the only sounds the creak of the wind through the rafters and the faint, distant snort of shadow outside. The stallion hadn't moved far. He was still watching, still waiting. Ethan crawled out of the chamber and stood, brushing dirt from his jeans. His hands were shaking, though he tried to hide it. "Do we keep going?" Jesse asked, his voice low. Ethan hesitated. "Not until the sheriff gets here." Ruby looked at him. "Are you going to tell them about Lester?" "Every word," Ethan said. "We need to know why this was built, why she died in here, and who made sure no one found her." They stepped out of the barn into the fading afternoon light. A pale sun hung low behind the clouds, casting the mountains in sharp relief. Shadow stood by the fence, ears flicking. His breathing had slowed, but his eyes were still fixed on the barn. Ethan walked over to him, reached a hand toward the horse's neck. Shadow didn't flinch this time. He leaned into the touch, warm and solid beneath Ethan's palm. "You knew," Ethan murmured. "All this time, you knew something wasn't right." Jesse joined them, watching with arms folded. "I've known you for 20 years, Ethan. Never seen you look like this." Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at the barn, at the hidden wall they'd uncovered. "Someone locked her in there," he said quietly, "and then covered it up." Ruby's voice carried across the wind. "And maybe that someone's still out there." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ethan turned toward the house. "I'm calling Sheriff Hayes." As he walked away, Shadow let out one soft snort, then turned his head toward the barn again. His ears twitched, his body tensed, and inside the barn, the silence felt heavier than ever, like it wasn't done speaking yet. Sheriff Marlon Hayes arrived with the kind of grim resolve that only came from decades of walking into things you couldn't unsee. He stepped out of his cruiser, nodded once to Ethan, and reached for the brim of his hat with a sigh. "Morning, Ethan. Heard you found something buried in your barn?" Ethan's face was unreadable. "Not something, someone." It took the better part of the afternoon for the forensics team from Teton County to comb through the crawl space. They worked with surgical precision, dusting, documenting, gently bagging the skeletal remains and the fragments of cloth, hair, and personal items that had lain hidden for 2 decades. They moved slowly, as if even sound might disturb the weight of what had been buried there. Outside, the sun crept lower behind the ridgeline. The shadows lengthened across the pasture where Shadow stood calmly now, his usual unease replaced by a quiet watchfulness. Ethan stood with Sheriff Hayes by the fence, both men staring at the barn. "She scratched her name into the wall," Ethan said. "Claire Monroe." Ruby recognized her. She was a schoolteacher here, went missing 20 years ago. Marlon exhaled through his nose. "I remember. I was a deputy back then. Lester Crane was the main suspect, but no evidence, no witnesses. The case went cold." Ethan shook his head. "You were looking in the wrong place." "That barn was searched back then," Marlon said. "Not behind a fake wall, it wasn't." Inside, one of the techs emerged from the barn with a clipboard in hand and a grim expression. "Sheriff, you're going to want to see this." Ethan, Ruby, and Jesse followed as Marlon ducked under the caution tape. The tech pointed to the back wall of the crawl space, where more markings had been uncovered in the stone, faint inscriptions etched with a desperate, shaking hand. There was a string of dates, counted off in scratches like tally marks, weeks, maybe months. Beside them were fragments of phrases. "He watches me," "can't breathe," and "he said no one would ever find me." Ruby's voice cracked. She was alive in there, for a long time. Marlon's jaw tightened. "We'll run dental records, confirm what we already know. Then I'll have to notify next of kin." "She's got one," Ruby said, stepping forward. "Her mother." Edna Monroe. Still lives down near Antelope Flats. 87 years old. Ethan looked over, startled. She's still alive. Barely, Ruby said. She stopped speaking about Claire years ago. Said she felt her daughter was close. Everyone thought she was just... She hesitated. Grieving. A day later, Sheriff Hayes himself drove Edna Monroe to the property. The old woman was thin and frail, wrapped in a thick shawl that looked handmade, her hair tied back with a pale yellow ribbon. Ruby held her arm as they approached the barn. Ethan opened the gate quietly. Shadow lifted his head from grazing and turned toward them. As they neared, the stallion walked over, uninvited, slow, deliberate. Edna stopped in her tracks. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached a hand toward the horse. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. "You were watching." Shadow lowered his head and pressed gently into her palm. The old woman cradled his face like he was made of something fragile. "You brought her home," she whispered. The air went still. Inside the barn, the crawlspace had been sealed temporarily. A forensic tarp covered the opening, but Edna didn't ask to see it. She stood in silence outside, her hand still resting on Shadow's mane, eyes fixed on the weathered boards. "Lester Crane," she said suddenly, voice sharp despite her age. "That man never stopped watching her. He told her once that if he couldn't have her, no one would." Jessie nodded slowly. "They dated, right?" She left him. He didn't take it well. Edna's eyes narrowed. "He moved out of town soon after Claire vanished. Said he was going west. That was the last I heard of him." Marlin opened his notebook. "We're already checking old addresses, aliases, job records. If he's alive, we'll find him." And they did. Within 48 hours, Lester Crane was located living under the name Gerald Denton in Sparks, Nevada. A former janitor at a private school, retired, living alone. The arrest came quickly and quietly. The evidence pulled from the barn was enough for a warrant, and once confronted with the remains and the etched confession carved in desperation by Claire herself, Lester folded like damp paper. He confessed, told them everything. He'd built the hollow with his own hands, knew no one would look inside a horse barn, especially once he'd faked a maintenance permit during the property's renovation. He bragged about how clever he was, how he'd kept her close, right where no one would ever think to look. And then he said something that made Marlin's blood run cold. She never stopped screaming. Not for the first week. Then she started scratching the walls. When I heard her name echoing in my sleep, I knew I had to make it stop. He smiled faintly. "But it came back. Every year. Especially in winter. Then you bought the place, Brooks, and that black horse of yours." He leaned forward in the interrogation room. It was his eyes. "Every time I saw him in the newspaper or on your Christmas cards, the horse was watching me." Marlin sat back in his chair. "You lost sleep over a horse?" Lester blinked. "That horse never stopped looking at me. Not once." Back in Jackson Hole, Ethan stood by the now empty barn, Ruby beside him. They had removed every board from the back wall, leaving it open to the elements. The coroner's van was long gone. The silence left behind was heavier than before, but different. Not haunted, not anymore. Shadow stood nearby, relaxed and still. "I'm tearing it down," Ethan said. Ruby raised a brow. "The whole barn?" "I'm building a new one, over on the other side of the pasture. This one." He looked up at the wood beams overhead. "This one's been lying for 20 years. Ruby nodded. "You gonna tell people what happened?" Ethan hesitated. "They'll know. The town will talk." "They already are," she said softly, "and most of them think your horse solved a murder." Ethan gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe he did." Ruby looked toward the clearing sky. "Some things find their way home, Ethan, even if it takes 20 years. They buried Claire Monroe beneath a cottonwood tree on the edge of town, where the mountains opened wide and the wind carried long, soft whispers through the grass. It wasn't far from the school where she once taught second grade, and just down the hill from the old church with the peeling white steeple. The whole town came. Children, now grown, who still remembered her gentle laugh. Elderly couples who'd once shaken their heads at her disappearance and moved on with guilt stitched into the quiet. Ruby stood near the front, holding Edna Monroe's hand as the pastor read from a letter Claire had written weeks before her disappearance. A letter Ruby had found, tucked inside a book donated to the library years ago. The words were simple, full of hope. Even when people stop listening, I believe truth finds a way. And even when we feel forgotten, the world remembers us in strange, beautiful ways. Ethan stood at the back with Shadow beside him, the horse still and composed, ears flicking toward the wind like he was listening to something only he could hear. A few people nodded toward Ethan, others toward Shadow. Quiet thanks. A shared acknowledgement that neither man nor beast could fully explain what had been uncovered, only that it had finally come to light. Lester Crane had pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree. No trial. No drawn-out statements. The moment he saw the photo of Claire's locket, he folded. I hear her voice again, he told the judge, voice hollow. I saw that damn horse in my dreams for years. It wasn't guilt that brought me back. It was him. He'd pointed to the newspaper clipping showing Ethan and Shadow taken the day after the remains were found. I can't sleep because he won't stop staring. The town had no interest in vengeance, only in closure. Claire's body had been lost in silence for 20 years. Now, with her name on people's lips again, it felt like a promise had been fulfilled. Back at the ranch, Ethan stood before the barn for the last time. The demolition crew arrived early. He didn't watch it come down. He sat with Shadow by the edge of the pasture as the first boards were pulled free and the roof collapsed in on itself. The dust rose like smoke and settled over the frozen earth, blanketing what had once been a hiding place for horror. In its place, Ethan built something different. He chose a new patch of land near the creek and started from the ground up. No corners hidden, no back walls to lie. A new barn, simple, wide open, honest. Shadow was the first to step inside, and this time he did it willingly. No hesitation, no pinned ears or wild eyes, just a calm, steady gait and a low nicker as he found his stall. Ethan exhaled, his chest finally loosening in a way he hadn't realized it had been tight. He carved a small wooden sign and placed it near where the old barn once stood. Not a memorial, exactly, just a name. Claire's Garden. He let wildflowers grow there, laid down a bench made from the beams of the old barn, and sometimes at night he'd sit there with a cup of black coffee, watching the moon rise over the Tetons while Shadow grazed nearby. One evening, Ruby joined him, her scarf whipping in the wind, cheeks red from the cold. "You still thinking about leaving town?" she asked. Ethan shook his head slowly. "For a while, I thought I didn't belong anywhere. But this place—" He glanced toward Shadow. "Maybe it needed me as much as I needed it." She smiled. "Some animals carry truth better than we do." Ethan looked at her. "You really believe that?" "I do now," Ruby said. "Shadow never gave up. Even when the world forgot Claire, he didn't." They sat in silence for a while, watching clouds pass across the moon. The story traveled far beyond Jackson Hole. Local news became regional, then national. Shadow was featured in magazines. Animal advocacy groups called him a hero, and a horse rescue in Montana offered to name a wing after him. Ethan politely declined. He didn't need a statue or a plaque. Shadow didn't need fanfare. He'd already done what no human could. One morning in early spring, Edna Monroe returned to the ranch. She walked with a cane now, slower, quieter. Ethan met her at the edge of Claire's garden. "I wanted to see where she was found," she said softly. He led her to the bench, helped her sit. Shadow stood nearby, watching. Edna reached out a hand toward the horse again. You brought her back to me. Shadow lowered his head gently. She was never truly gone, Ethan said, only waiting to be remembered. Edna nodded slowly. And now, she is. That night, as Ethan locked up the new barn, he stood for a moment beneath the stars. The air was crisp, the sky sharp with constellations. Shadow stood just outside the stall, tail swaying in the breeze, eyes soft and alert. Ethan ran a hand along the stallion's neck. You did good, boy. Shadow snorted quietly, then turned his gaze toward the open pasture, ears twitching at some distant sound Ethan couldn't hear. Maybe it was just wind, or maybe it was something else, something only horses like Shadow understood. The memory of voices long buried, the pull of something broken finally made whole. Whatever it was, it didn't scare him anymore. The truth had been unearthed, the forgotten remembered, and Ethan Brooks, once a man trying to disappear, had helped a voice long silenced speak again.